Welcome to a question and answer edition of the podcast. Thanks for all of you who submitted. Mostly, if not actually all this time, we're on the Instagram story. So let's get to the questions here, and we'll start with a great one from Ty Lopez. And Ty asks, to what extent do you use roughhousing games in warm-up and training? Would all athletes benefit from it, even all types of runners? Read somewhere that even Roger Bannister was coached in a little bit of wrestling type roughhousing, so that's awesome. I didn't realize that example with Roger Bannister, the first man to break the 4-minute mile. I know that with working with swimmers, including distance swimmers, I use roughhousing in the weight room. So as part of our warm-ups and warm-up training, a lot of times it was very much just for the purpose of more physical and mental engagement, a gateway of fun and joy into the training. And I also scaled it. I've probably told this story before where I had multiple layers of how aggressive you wanted to get with the roughhousing. On the least aggressive level, I would just do games of push hands, and where athletes were just trying to stand next to each other, maybe 3 feet apart, and then they would try to push the hands of the other person, pushing them over, or you could fake and pull your hands away and the other person falls forward. So that was scaled to, you had like a kneeling, both athletes are in a tall kneeling position, and then they have a medicine ball, and then they're going to be trying to wrestle the medicine ball away from the other person. That was more of one of those like bigger, like rogue soft medicine balls. If you do it with a smaller medicine ball, you can. It's just a little bit more rough, and as the ball is a little bit harder of a surface. And then that was all the way up to, on the most aggressive side, I had kind of like across the river where I had people standing on like a ground pound bag, I believe, or something like that, where this was back at Cal. And they would have like a push the other person off the log type fight, or we'd have a little circle and they could try to hip check the other person out of the circle. That was the most aggressive end of the spectrum. And interestingly, athletes would choose, you had almost an equal number of athletes in each bucket in terms of what their choices were. And so some athletes really desired more of that roughhousing experience. Some athletes desired less. But how it fits into running, you could certainly do that same type of idea in a weight room gym situation. Of course, the caveat being, yes, we don't want to hurt people. We don't want to injure people. We want to create a as safe of experience as possible, where we still can get that joy and excitement that can lead to engagement throughout the lifting session. You also can do this type of thing before the run as kind of a fun pre-run type idea. I know for high jump, in high jump practice now, working with high schoolers currently, we will do roughhousing type games for that same purpose as part of the warm-up. A lot of times we'll have athletes do things where it's they're holding each other's right hand, and then they're doing a knee tap game. So they're trying to tap the other person's knees. With high jump, I like just anything like that we'll do, or like a foot tap game, like you're trying to tap on top of the other person's foot. That one can get a little bit more dangerous. You don't want someone to stub their toe or kick the other person in the shin, although it's really not too aggressive of a game. But I like to constrain those games where there is like, you could just do like a knee tap game, which is also fun. I've done even tournaments with that, where you'll have athletes, they're in a ring, and you have to quick reach in and tap the other person's knee, and you get a point. It's a wrestling game. I like constraining it to a handhold because you're more connected to the other person. I like David Duran's The Breath, Eyes, and Touch. You're getting more touch in the session, so you're connecting and you get that physical human touch. So it's just great for engagement as well as just the mental and total health of the training session. And then there's it's also, in some ways, you're also constraining the lateral capabilities. So if you want to start with something it could be earlier in the sequence, you actually constrain it to holding hands and then touching the knees or the foot, and you can't move around as much. So it's very mentally engaging, but you're not really getting into the ballistic physical movements yet. And then you could release the hand holds after a few rounds of that. And I like that work for jumps, and you could use it for running too. I think it'd be great, but in jumping specifically, you do that lateral motion and lateral movements really fit well with that accelerating, change of direction, jumping access, because there is a little bit more deeper knee angles in many cases. A high jump with someone who has a really straight plant leg, you may not get as much, but there's still a ton of rotational qualities, decelerating type qualities. And so I find that it actually fits with the qualities of a jump event very well. Now, if we're talking distance running or longer running, things that obviously there's not like a curve running arc to it, and it's not quite as, you could say, athletic in the sense of a triple jump or high jump or something, I still think that it is engaging. I think that it's mentally joyful. I think it also, it's funny because you could get a group that's very conditioned in running in a straight line because of the running efficiency for part of it at least. But then you get into dynamic roughhousing and you're going to see people get really, really tired who you would think normally wouldn't, just because where you are efficient in running, now you are actually very inefficient when it comes to wrestling and roughhousing around with other people. So in some ways, it's also an alternative form of conditioning. So I think it's great. I mean, I love infusing any sort of play-based activity into training when I can. So if I was working with a group of runners or cross-country runners, I'm sure we would end up doing it at least once a week just for that fun aspect of it. I like using games in general as well with those groups. And in the run coaching I do when I do consulting for running, I don't do this so much for the run training. Occasionally we'll do things. This is with military, like special forces trainees, people who are going to special forces buds boot camp, is we will on the field days sometimes warm up with, for example, we have a group of 4 people and 3 guys are holding hands. And then the 4th guy is trying to tag one person, but they ultimately have to run around the other 2 people holding hands who are blocking them. We'll use that as a warm-up sometimes for that exact same purpose. It's just getting mentally engaged in a different way into the session. And the thing with games too, or games and roughhousing, is it really, sometimes you can overly strategize your workout. And I think Richard Eschavis talked about the different frames of mind when you train. And I think in running especially, it can be a very strategizing type occurrence. So you know the workout, let's say you're a distance runner, and okay, my workout's going to be, well, let's just say it's 5 times 1,000 or something. I'm just throwing a workout out there. And you're going to strategize how you're going to go about that 5 times 1,000. And when you're doing roughhousing, though, some of that strategizing sometimes goes out the window. A lot of times it does. And so often I see this, I've seen this in some of the best, when I was an assistant cross-country coach at Wilmington College. And by assistant cross-country coach, I mean, I ran around the clipboard and I got people's splits and I gave them to the coach. I wasn't writing the workouts there. But I did learn a lot about running through that experience. And one memory I'll always have is an athlete who, I think he outperformed his seed going into the conference meet by 3 or 4 spots. He ran a personal best time. And I remember him distinctly, like maybe the first half mile into the race or right at the start, maybe it was, he threw off his watch or whatever he was going to get the splits with. And he just ran with the lead runners. He ran with the lead pack, didn't worry about his splits, and he just competed. And I do think that there's something to be said about, hey, we're just competing here. Just even if, and that's, of course, you're going to compete if you're doing running and splits and things, but a lot of times it's still based on a time. It's still based on, hey, and that's good for running, but roughhousing is something that can put you just purely into competing. And I think we all need that no matter what sport we do in some way, shape, or form. And it's a great and fun way to get that in there. So probably a little bit longer answer than I had meant with that question, but it's a great one. And I'm glad you asked it, Ty. And I'm also glad you had that example of Roger Bannister in there, because I did not know that. So I'm glad I know that now. Next question is from Do You Even Bowl? I think I got that written down correctly. This is a really cool one, and it's very pertinent, being it now a new year here, 2025. And he asks, what have you picked up and dropped in the past training year? And I find it's a fun practice, really, in doing all these podcasts to go through and say, okay, well, wow, I picked this training piece up from this podcast back here, and here's how I've written it into my training programs that I write. Here's how I've used it in my own training. And oftentimes it's a mix of things I'm either using in my own training, I'm writing for clients, or it's a little bit of both. A lot of times it starts with things that I do, and then it'll fit into clients, and if it sticks and works, it'll maintain itself. But the first thing I'll talk about is mostly or more so something that has really picked up for me in the last year, and I do use this for clients who have the equipment. It's not expensive, but it's sandbag training. And that was something that a long time, I shouldn't say that long, but somewhere in the early 300s, I had Julian Pinot on, and he was talking about sandbag training, sandbag squats a lot, and then in the sense of okay, a lot of times you don't have a squatting problem as a human being. It's just how it's set up. Someone who might look terrible in a back squat, a barbell back squat, may actually look quite good if you just have them hug a sandbag and squat with it. And if you look at our basic human function and what tasks we might be asked to do in a more, you could say caveman situation, but just a more physical labor-based situation, it would be much more common that maybe you're picking up a rock or a heavier log type object with your arms wrapped around it in front, and it acts as a natural counterbalance. So in so many senses, this is a very natural way of moving. And so this past year, my youngest daughter, she's just turning 1 in a week here. And when she was born last year, I said to myself, like, I don't have time. And just with everything, with having a young baby in the house, and also just looking to take a little bit of a break from doing a lot of training and regular training throughout the course of the previous years, I said, I'll just do sandbag training. I'll just have a sandbag in the garage, and I'll just go do some squats and deadlifts and some cleans and presses. I had 2 sandbags. One was a heavy sandbag for more of the deadlifts and the squats, and the other one was for cleans and presses. And basically this whole past year, I've been doing my strength work. You could say my ground-based lifting, like the squat and deadlift pattern, has been 95% sandbag training, almost entirely sandbag training. And that's something I think is really cool and important to, at some point in a career, say, okay, I'm only going to do this type of training for an extended period of time to really see how it works and operates. And in doing that, I will say a few things with the sandbag. One is my back and my trunk are very strong and feel really good. So it was, I think it was either 2 or maybe 3, I want to say 2 years ago, I decided to really ramp up my traditional weight training and strength training in the winter months. From really late November of, I think, 2022 to early 2023, really punching it on hex bar deadlifts and traditional Olympic lifts and all these things, and taking time to bring that back up again above what I normally would, where typically I really prioritize the dynamic work and then do the weight training to fill in the gaps. I really tried to ramp up and get stronger again in the barbell work. And I'm not saying this is why this happened, but it was about March of 2023. I really ran into back problems, and it wasn't a single aggressive workout. It was just after a normal workout one day, I couldn't sprint with any sort of full stride for about a month's time. And I really do believe that, especially the heavy hex bar deadlifting, which was one of the main lifts, for me at that time in my life, and I think I could have handled it very easily earlier, but I do think that ramping up just took my body to a place where it did struggle to recover from there at that time. And in working with the sandbag since then, I've felt way, way healthier, more connected, and more naturally strong. Now, that's not to say I wouldn't go back to traditional lifting or that I'm not going to. In fact, I am starting to weave in a lot more single leg patterns with the hex bar now. I did some filming for my Speed ID mini course back in November. And so it was actually the first time I got in the weight room after doing 10 months of basically exclusive strength training with the sandbag. And the bar moved really well. I felt really strong. I didn't feel like I missed that much. And I felt like if I were to keep going with the barbell, even for just a few weeks, I would pick that strength back up very quickly. And so do I think that all athletes need to do only sandbag training for their strength piece? No, I don't think so. But I do think it's one of those things where once you move past, let's just say that highest performance, highest intensity point where you're maxing out everything through traditional means, if you eventually moving forward and doing things that are just a little bit more healthy, counterbalance for your body, and really work muscles, and especially those inner squeezing muscles, in a way that fits with natural human function, I do believe that sandbag training should be a good staple, or at least a movement that's incorporated in that process. And if nothing else, you can learn from it. You can learn from the way that the counterbalance happens, the way it feels. Also, in addition to that, I've been doing a lot more sandbag carries, and that's even more so after the most recent Julian Pineau podcast. And for me, my winter months is more a time of, you could just say general GPP. So I put the timers away for sprinting in the winter, and I just focus on different ways to be fit and different ways to explore strength. And so one of my main fitness GPP workouts has been carrying a sandbag up and down my driveway in different methods and manners. So I might go down and then walk up forwards. I might go down and walk up backwards, maybe laterally. Maybe I do a fast shuffle on the way up. And it is an awesome GPP workout. It's relatively low impact on lower legs. Of course, it's good to train lower legs through like things like tempo sprinting and things like that. But if you want to go basically reduce the stress on the Achilles and some of those tissues and connective tissues of the lower leg for winter months, it is an awesome way to do that. If you're putting the heel down, you are getting some reciprocal motion involved, especially when you're going down the hill. Again, it's a good counterbalance. And one of my favorite workouts I've done with that's been really, it's like the ultimate 20-minute workout if you want to keep it around 20 minutes, was one of my neighbors came over in the morning and we had a 130-pound bag and about a 90-pound bag. And we just traded every time up and down the hill, did every minute on the minute. And we did the following pattern. It was go down, walk forward up, go down, walk backwards up, and then go down like a fast shuffle or a sprint up with the bag. And it was just a really cool, powerful, dynamic workout. It's very natural and with the gait cycle. You could also mix like push-ups or various trunk exercises at the top of the hill in between the carries. So just expanding on the sandbag more as a general fitness tool. I'm not saying, I mean, I do think there's certainly really great application for athletes. I never want to say any tool is the ultimate, but I will say for me at this point in my life, it has been phenomenal. And I think for just general fitness, so often we associate general fitness, more general physical preparedness with barbell activities. Those are amazing. But I think for a lot of people, just doing more with the sandbag is a really cool thing. I've been doing more with it, and I would definitely recommend. It's also just really inexpensive. It's a very cheap training tool. It's very versatile. You can take it anywhere. And so I think it's one of those things that if you're into fitness, you really need to experience or work with at one time or another. Another thing has been working breathing patterns, both breathing patterns and breath patterns into movements itself. And then there's two contexts to that I'll get into. And then there's also breathing as it fits with running, which I've been doing for a little while, but I've been exploring even more in the past year. So I'll talk first about breathing into basic movements. I think this was a recent podcast I spoke on this where it was with Mike Salemi a long time ago. This was a podcast we recorded, but we were both in the Bay Area, in San Francisco area, and I did a workout with him in his garage gym setup. And he had a lot of kind of like wrestling, grappling type. I think he had like the Bulgarian bags and a lot of bands like cords. But we would do all these twisting, bending, kind of like working down into a lateral lunge, I remember, and going across with the band and back up and like spiraling with the band. But everything was coordinated with the breathing pattern, inhales and exhales on everything. And it's interesting when you do that. Anytime you really have a conscious breath pattern into training, they talk about meditation in the same way. Like, when do you stop to have enough awareness on your breath and your breathing patterns? And so that was my first exposure to really intentional breathing in basic exercise. And then speaking of Julian Pineau and then Richard Eschavis, there were some videos of Richard's I was watching where he would time the movement to your inhale or your exhale. And he would use the inhale, for example, or how long you could inhale to dictate the range of the movement. And I've been going into a lot of, obviously, if you've been listening to this podcast, a lot more of Bill Hartman's work. And Bill Hartman's model talking a lot about reciprocal motion and breathing. And if you're holding your breath through movements, then there's a very likely chance you're doing a lot of orientation, or where instead of joints twisting, you could say twisting relative to another. I'm trying to think of a good example that's not just that wordage, but just basically you could think of one joint or bone spiraling on the other in a different direction. Versus orienting, they're both working in the same direction. And orientation has its benefit. If you need to sprint fast or lift a heavy weight, you have to orient somewhere. You have to lock joints somewhere. But in terms of, let's just say we have high performance on one side and recovering and moving really well on the other. I mean, I guess you want to move well when you perform on a high level, but just stick with the example here. breathing through movements and letting joints work reciprocally and getting good motion. You could think that just really, you could say lubricating the joints with motion. That helps you to feel better the next day. It helps you to recover well. It helps you to have movement options. And I remember that day after working out with Mike Salemi, where we were doing everything to the breath and doing a lot of rotational movements. And the lateral lunges are so good too. There's like those lengthening things. My body felt so good the next day. I felt bouncy. I felt loose, ready to go. I've heard people say the same thing about breathing and really incorporating breathing patterns into their training consciously. And so I've been doing a lot more of that this year, thinking about writing this into programming, writing breath-based, where breath dictates the range of motion, working through that and being conscious of that myself. And then, of course, if you're looking at the work that Bill Hartman and a lot of people who have learned from Bill have done, or looking at the work of PRI, there is a lot of work in terms of expanding the rib cage, opening up spaces, and I've learned more and more about the breath and the potential of the breath to open up spaces. So in both using it as a barometer and then using it to open up spaces and looking at how the rib cage responds, I've been doing a lot more of that. Also in terms of running. So in terms of running, ever since I've started more running coaching, I've always looked at, and this was especially confirmed with reading James Nestor's book, Breath, is he talked about athletes who did breath control in the midst of their distance running training on land. And he gave an example of a Finnish athlete who just was ridiculously good and used a lot of conscious breath control in his own run training. And I would think about swimmers I worked with, and swimming forces you to have a breath rhythm because you have the water and you have turning your head and breathing and putting your head under the water and so on and so forth. So in swimming, it naturally happens. And people talk about how swimmers just have a massive work capacity. And I think a good portion of that capacity is found in the rhythm that naturally occurs of breath hold and then of breath holding, inhaling, and exhaling as it fits with the water. And I remember when I was in graduate school in the sports science and the physiology wing of my graduate degree, the professor was talking about how ventilation was not a limiting factor in how good athletes could be in their distance running. And so I always discounted it. That was like almost the early check mark where I'm like, okay, well, how you breathe doesn't matter that much and how good your running endurance is, so whatever. But now I don't know the exact specifics of that research. I don't remember it. All I know is whatever study was quoted set me up to discount that. But now, in understanding more about what I mentioned with swim, what I mentioned with and that example I mentioned, but further, the rhythm of the breath. I think that's like the missed thing, because sometimes we look at things as purely black and white and we don't look at, well, how did the person breathe? Not maybe just, well, what was your pure ventilation? And honestly, I think looking at some of the respiration training, I do think that actually makes a difference. So I don't know maybe where that research came from. I do think your ventilatory power makes a big difference. I've heard a lot of work with the I think it's called the Spiro Tiger. It's been so long since I did podcasts on that, my memory escapes me. But if you can have a good ventilatory capacity and you're great with the rhythm of that capacity, that's its own, we talk about dance and the ability to perform physical external movements with a rhythm and make it look good. There's a rhythm to the way the breath works too. So I've ever since I've done run coaching, I've been big into having breathing rhythms as you run and using breathing along with step rhythms as you run. And for one, it gets you mindful in the moment. You kind of get away from just the external and you really get into your body, into your breathing, into the step, and you can feel it. But there's more rhythms than just, and you can go, okay, I'm going to nose breathe only. I'm going to take 3 steps, and every time I exhale, I'll exhale through 3 lefts and I'll inhale through 3 lefts, for example. Or maybe it's 2 lefts, it's higher performance. Or maybe I'm really trying to draw my endurance out and I'll make it 4 lefts. So you could do that. But then you can even stack different, more like double inhale type rhythms on top of that. And it can be really dynamic. And you can actually really, once you catch the right breathing rhythm, that breathing rhythm can carry you. And so that's something I've also been incorporating more throughout this last year. I think that those rhythmic pieces are a big game changer. And I think if at some point to really get in touch with that breath pattern, rhythm, and awareness within your movements is really helpful and important. Another thing along those lines is just rhythms and cadences. I've been very big into rhythmic type, let's just say plyometrics, oscillations, and those types of activities for a while. I'm getting more into it in just basic sprinting. So if we're talking hertz or cycles per second and how fast is your stride, I've heard sprint coaches talk about that. I've taken that on a lot in the last year and worked with that in various ways. And I do think it can get the one downfall, I think, or maybe the reason we don't hear about, okay, I'm going to run at this many cycles a second and I have like a metronome or a beats per minute thing going, is because it actually is happening so fast. Sometimes it can kill your fluid. I shouldn't say sometimes. It can be very destructive to fluidity to try to sprint, especially with a slightly asymmetrical rhythm of sprinting on a symmetrical metronome pattern. So there's different ways that I've been exploring going through that, things with 4 counts and things like that. And it's been awesome. And when you layer frequencies, it can be amazing. I've been using a lot of that type of work with online clients. They've been getting great results. And so that is something I am sold on and exploring more. So to sum that up, rhythm in both breath and the way that we hook cadence up to a stride. Of course, cadence with distance running is synonymous. People use cadence and those types of ideas a lot. I use that in the longer run programs as well. People will also tell you with the longer run programs, don't get hung up on one cadence or the perfect cadence. I do believe that ultimately there's an art to that whole thing. The final thing that I've been working on that really picking up in the last year has been error amplification. Amplifying the error is honestly, if you, it's so interesting what gets taught in coaching or sports performance, strength and conditioning, coaching in general. And if I was writing a motor learning or an athlete learning or a coaching handbook, error amplification would be one of the very first things that I would put in the curriculum, because when you understand and see error amplification and how powerful it is, it really can change your whole mindset with how we learn in general, just because so often our first thought with coaching is, okay, and this is before we even get into cueing and analogies and more cueing that fits with how athletes actually learn. Most coaches start with, okay, what are the best cues? What are the best drills? How am I building an athlete as if I, as the coach, am the one who is directly coordinating and putting everything together? And there's this one optimal technique, and I am like laying down all the pieces that steer the athlete into that technique. That's not how it goes. And when you take on error amplification, you see in spades how much how much the athlete is solving the problem and how little you as the coach and your input is helping to solve that problem. Now, I do think there can be really good analogies and external cues that can be helpful, but as I've seen it, the error amplification it's a kingpin in many ways. And there's good research, showing that error amplification is far more powerful than other cueing methods. And so, for example, I can tell you a little bit how I use this in a recent high jump practice. And I've written emails, if you're on my newsletter, highlighting some different arenas with this. But just one recent, you can look up too. I should link it, or I'll link it in the show notes to this. There's research showing that teaching standing long jump to athletes, I think it was a younger cohort, it might have been like middle school age or something, but they found that athletes who were taught with direct cues, like here's how you do the standing long jump, and given more the typical thoughts on how to do it, I think that group improved it might have been like a 4-week time period, maybe 8. Hopefully I have my time right, but they improved like 2 to 5 centimeters on their standing broad jump. The group that was coached through an error amplification, basically they did directly the wrong thing. And I don't know if it was the whole time or part of the time, but they ended up improving like 20 centimeters. It was a staggering difference. And the cool thing is to think, oh, wow, I didn't even have to tell an athlete any of how to do this. I just showed them the wrong way, and their brain, their subconscious, that part of them that I want to say it's Gary. I'm thinking about Gary Ward. Yeah, it was Gary Ward who said the body or the brain is hardwired for perfection. And if that's the point you start with, then you can understand that error amplification more, because if I give it the body, brain, the system information, and it's really rich because this is the opposite of what you need to do. The body knows that's not going to work, but it has even more information. It just expands out the bandwidth of all the possibilities. And then it can put together a better solution. And so one of the ways I've worked with this recently in high jump is I had athletes, it's kind of silly because if you busted this out at most practices, people would just think, what are you talking about? But I had athletes alternate where they did one jump so if anyone's been around high jump, by the way, you know, you need to do an arch over the bar. You lay out backwards, like a back bridge, essentially. You arch back over the bar. And so instead of that, I had athletes do a cannonball over the bar. I said, do a cannonball. And it was actually really funny because I got a lot of different types of cannonballs. My athletes who were really good at high jump and spinning and rotating did kind of a spinning, rotating cannonball. But every other jump, so they would do a cannonball jump and then they would do a regular jump. And my only instruction was just notice what your body does when you do the regular jump. And when the athletes did the regular jump, I saw things out of them trending in the right direction that I had never seen before because it was their own brain and system putting together all the information richly in a way that made sense for their body. And one of the really cool things about error amplification as well is it takes the pressure off. There's kind of pressure when you cue an athlete and they're thinking, okay, I'm expected to do this. How can I do this? How can I put this together? You're thinking of moving towards the coach's cue. You're feeling a little bit of pressure to perform, that cue correctly. But when you're said, hey, okay, do the wrong thing. Okay, that was wrong. Okay, now just sprint or jump or throw however you want and just notice how your body does it. Now there's much more freedom in that because it's freedom for your body to now create in a way that makes sense for it, given, well, I just did the way wrong thing. And so it's, to me, the experience of just noticing what your body decides to do on its own is really incredible. And so that's one that I've really picked up and done more of this past year. I'll just mention a way for sprinting. It's a little bit more universal just because everyone sprints and accelerates and those kind of things. But so in sprinting or acceleration, a very common cue or thought or action that people want is the let's say the swing leg that comes out in front of you, that shin of the swing leg. That is, people do not want that, and for good reason, you don't want that leg to fall just straight perpendicular down to the ground. That doesn't create a good angle to push into the next step. People want an angle of the shin and foot that's going to be able to direct force back. And so what you can do is you can actually exaggerate that. So you could say, instead of trying to say, hey, I want you to really steer your shin angle so you can produce force backwards or push backwards or whatever, just say, hey, I want you to run and I want you to swing your shins out kind of like you're bounding or, so you're almost swinging your shin out forwards. Have someone run like that for a couple reps and then let them just run how they want. And you will see those shin angles absolutely transform. I've actually seen it happen with athletes where their body tried to sit them down so much into so good of angles, they actually weren't even ready for it. And so it's such an interesting way to coach because it gives you so many new insights that you would have never gotten. It shows you the problem-solving nature of athletes. It takes pressure off you as a coach in terms of trying to find all the right cues or all the exact cues. And it also takes pressure off the athlete because they can notice how their body does when it's just allowed to do what it wants. So I think it's an amazing cueing, motor learning system. Motor learning is one of my favorite topics, and it's one that I love talking about. I think it's one that I hope as the coaching world moves forward that it's one we talk about and integrate more into what we do. And I think things like exaggerate the error, that they're so powerful and exciting. I think those are things that can help push that aspect of coaching forward. I will say, as with all cues, people talk about cueing. I think this was a Dan Paff quote, or maybe I've heard Boo Schnecksader, or maybe both talk about it, but cues having a shelf life. You don't want to use the same cues or instructions forever. And I do think the same thing with exaggerate the error. I do think there's a time and a place for it, but I don't think it's something you want to necessarily do every single practice or every single season of the year. I think it's a powerful learning tool. It's a cool tool to see how your body learns and operates, and then you can work with it going forward. So I've been using that for all sorts of movements. Absolutely love it, and I think it really changes or can change the way that we look at how the body coordinates movement and learns movement in general. Okay, next question. Kevin MC17 asks, latest observation in young kids training sports as a parent or coach. So I've been able to play both roles this past year as a parent with my children ages 6 and 8 in sports. Well, my daughter who's 1, obviously not yet, and then coaching youth soccer again. And so the first thing I'll mention, actually, Kevin, is something that I got from your program, your online program, Athletic Development Games. I think it's PlayBoost now, being PlayBoost now. But you had something in there I used instantly with my children. Actually, one of the tools you got was just like a big 3-person jump rope. And it was where it's like one of those multicolored, really bright jump ropes. And I'll tell you, jump roping, and I know you know this, but for everybody listening, just having or watching kids jump rope, if we talk about plyometrics, I mean, it's such an underrated tool. To watch the rope visually to develop rhythm, and then the plyometric value is great. And so I'll give two basic scenarios based off something I learned within your coursework, Kevin. Was you had an exercise where it was a jump rope, and it was where I think you had tied one end of the jump rope to a wall, and you were just swinging the other end. So it's like a wiggly rope. It's like a rope in space, and it's just wiggling all over the place. And you had your kids jumping over this wiggling rope. And it's funny because I have, occasionally I'll play jumping games with my kids. I have plyo hurdles, and occasionally I'll set them up and I'll say, hey, do you kids want to jump over these? And the first time they'll be like, oh yeah, and they'll jump over it and we'll put it higher, and they'll keep going until they hit their peak. And then they kind of get bored, and I don't want to be an overbearing parent who always wants my kids to jump as high as possible, because I don't want them to feel pressured like that's what I really need to, like that's what I really, anyway, I don't want to overpressure them. And I also have an answer here that I'm trying to figure out if someone else asks me. So I was kind of, my mind's in two places. But anyways, what I found though is when I play that jump rope game with them, where the jump rope is spinning all over the place and wiggling all over the place, my kids love that. Their demeanor changes, their attitude towards that changes, because it's not, now jumping over that rope is not about, hey, Dad, as if they were going to associate, I need to jump high so Dad thinks this is good. Like, that's the last thing I want to think. I want them to do it because they love to do it, because it's fun. And that would be the same thing with jumping over a hurdle or whatever. And so when they jump over that like spinny, just whippy, windy rope, every time it's just fun. They're laughing and the demeanor changes. And so that's just helped me to look and understand at motivation and what things are fundamentally motivating to children. And then even taking that up into older athlete populations and task-based activities, even with older athletes, even looking at, okay, hey, I want you to jump over this hurdle and see how high you can go, versus, hey, jump over this kind of high hurdle and I'm going to throw you a ball and let's see if you can catch it in the air. And ultimately for older athletes, I think you can definitely and leverage both things. For younger athletes, just going with what is fun and exciting and intrinsically motivating is just so key. And so that also being said, I'll bring in, I think someone else asked this further on in the question list, but I'll get to it now. Maybe I'll skip it later, but I've been climbing. Every winter I go climbing. I get a climbing gym membership here in Loveland, Ohio, Mosaic Gym. It's awesome. And so I'll sign up my kids as well. And when I watch my son climb in particular, my daughter isn't quite as into it, but it's been funny watching, just not putting any pressure on her. She brings her like stuffed animal to the gym and just like makes imagination games up and climbs. But she's like doing stories with my son or her brother the whole time. And that's fun for her. But what's interesting is watching them when I'm not around. Like with my son especially, sometimes they'll be like, hey, do you want to try to climb this one? And, he'll climb it. But again, just like the jump rope and the hurdle, it's a little bit different, like mentality, because I'm there and you hope there's not an expectation of a parent that's pressuring him. But then what I love doing is I love it when I'm not around and they're off climbing in a corner and they can't see me and I'm doing some climbs. And I'll watch my son try to do a climb totally on his own. It's all him. It has nothing to do with me. That's my favorite because that's what he loves. And it teaches me a lot because it teaches me I need to get out of the way. I need to make sure they're doing things because they love it and it's interesting to them. And so anyways, just things that I've learned being a parent and watching my own children. And then my daughter as well, I found when she has other friends, like that my daughter and my son will meet a friend at the gym and they'll run around and play and climb. And then it was a recent day where they found a friend and my daughter also had her stuffed animals, making up all these stories. Without me in the picture, she just decides to do, this is a top rope auto belay. She was always afraid to climb all the way to the top of the higher climbs. And then all of a sudden she just does it on her own. She just decides she wants to do it. And just letting kids decide in their own time, I think is so important because I think we just live, as so many of us know, in this world of just utter pressure. And I do think that at the same time, I will say, and Kevin, I think you had posted this in one of your videos, is that the richest play is, and I know this for sure, watching youth sports in so many cases, some programs do a great job, but some not so much. But the richest play is children and with their parents. And I had read something that I forget what the hormone or the relationship with the young children with the mother is, as per what I read, but I know with the father, it's oxytocin based on play. It's like dad comes home, it's time to play. And I'm constantly reminded of that. And I saw that post and I just thought it was so good that you had posted that. But I just look at how I can be creative playing with my own children. And you think about that creativity, their joy, and the movements and what they're learning through joy in playing with the parent, versus you hope that they're getting something like that, especially in their early experiences with organized sport. Versus, I know a lot of parents I talk to, it's interesting to see what parents' observations is of their child's sport experience. I hear a lot of parents who are like, they actually are upset if their 6-year-old isn't doing enough drills or more formal, what they think is formal training. And I just think, again, education for the parents is critical there as well. But yeah, those are some things without getting long-winded, because that's something I could talk about forever. But those are some things that I've been looking at. And again, love what you're doing, Kevin. So keep putting out the good work there. And it's definitely been well received on my own part in working, training with my own children. Next question here, Jump High Sean. He asks, my 2-foot jump is 15 centimeters higher than my 1-foot jump. Practicing 1 foot would help 2 feet in my situation. So this is a great question, and it does link to the fact that, well, all jumps, be it 1 foot or 2 foot, are in essence, they are, I think this was an Adarian Barr quote, or he said something along these lines, but that all jumps are 1 foot in nature, because it's really that most lead foot is the one you're going to lever off of the most. Even in a 2-leg jump, the back foot in the 2-leg jump, because there is going to be a level of diagonal orientation towards the direction of the jump. Even with the baby penultimate folk, there is still a little bit of an offset, a little bit of diagonal. Those athletes will be more of a true 2-foot jump. And it is probably those types of people who would have the biggest discrepancy between the 1 and the 2 foot in so many cases. But at the end of the day, it really is so much of that ability of the 1 foot, the lead leg, to deflect. And in a 2-leg jump, what tends to happen is the arms kind of become the knee. So in a single leg jump, it just works with the gait cycle. It comes naturally to a lot of athletes, especially watching kids learn to jump. It's basically like an extension of skipping. And in the gait cycles, you run up off the ground and you have the drive knee. The swing leg becomes the drive knee. It's not a far step away from just running and skipping and things that kids do. As soon as you get to 2 feet, what happens is you still have that single leg in front, but now the arms, this big whip of the arms comes through. And if you watch that exact moment, the impulse of the front leg finishes and it starts to leave the ground, that's when that double arm block comes up in front and kind of acts as a drive knee. So you really do have a massive amount of similarity. I will say that in a 2-foot jump, you definitely do still get a fair amount of push off the second to last leg, but it's not like the deflection of that final leg in front. So that just being said, if it is that much of a differential, if it's a relatively extreme differential, I think there's definitely room to be gained and learned by practicing 1-foot jumps, but not just a 1-foot jump for height. I would recommend a lot of variability in that 1-foot jumping. So do some jumps for distance, do some jumps with a 180 spin, do some jumps just for height or over a barrier. And by practicing a lot of variability, you're then going to be able to put more of that variability into your typical 2-footing pattern. And especially if you had stalled out, for example. And that was the second question that was asked by Jump High Sean was, what's the growth curve of a vertical jump and how to break that plateau? And so the plateaus can happen for a variety of reasons. It could be a strength plateau. It could be a speed plateau. It could be a technical and a variability plateau because you've only been doing one type of jump for all of the training. So it could be an environmental plateau. So who are you training with? What's the environment you're training with? It could be a stale or a stagnation plateau. You've just been doing the same things for a very long period of time. In track and field, in many cases, athletes they'll be working with one coach. They break from that coach and they go with another group, another training group, another environment, another training system. A lot of very likely same core exercises and a lot of similar approaches to things, but just the variety and the change, they're able to instantly see a big boost in performance. And then, of course, that will level off. So it could be for a variety of reasons. If nothing else, a good experiment is to almost do an elimination of sorts of, you could eliminate, if I've just been doing bilateral squatting, just take that out of the program for a while, see what happens, maybe do some different things differently in the other ends of the program, or just change your environment entirely. There's a lot of ways that you can work with that. So that's almost its whole podcast, really. But I would look at things in terms of what you're doing on the level of speed, plateauing there, strength, plateauing there, environment, the variability, the ways you're jumping, plateauing there, and then the group of people, folks, individuals that you're around, and looking at that as well. So a lot of things you can work with plateauing, vertical jump, and really any other athletic skill. Next question is Barbarian Strength. So Barbarian Strength asks flywheel loading and velocity recommendations. So for me, I'm not a great person to answer this question. I've used flywheels like a K-Box. I've used Versa pulleys. I really like the tool. They're very alive in nature. But as I've seen it, and it's more been like a K-Box style piece of equipment I've used, is these, a lot of times people talk about the eccentric value, the eccentric loading, because you will pull up and it'll pull you down with the same force. But I like them more so for being a consistent force tool, meaning there's just consistent loading on the muscle. You can't rest at the top and hang out. It's something you have to keep going and keep working with. And with that consistent stability of loading, I actually really like them, especially for like a K-Box squat for tendon adaptations, just because you're not getting this moment where the tendon's getting yanked on in a reversal, for example. It's just a steady, consistent stressor. And so for people who've had knee issues, I've used it for high reps for that, and I've had good success. In terms of using it for, okay, let's look at all the ingredients of speed and power and how can we use the flywheel, I do think you can use it, but it's not been something that I would prefer more other methods, other types of plyometrics and sprint constraints and variations, and other things done with more traditional loads or oscillating loads in the gym. Not that you couldn't, I just haven't been there with it. I tend to like it more for its consistency in loading. In terms of things like the Versa pulley or things that are dynamic rotationally, I just haven't had enough experience there. I've used it. Paul Cater, I've been to his gym, absolutely love the way he uses it, and it feels so alive and dynamic, but he might be the guy to ask for that more than me. Next question is Hamza AUR. So he asks, can you go from being this is a great question, because if you would have asked me 4 years ago, I would have said something else. But having learned more about the biomechanics realm of things, I can give you a better answer now. He asks, can you go from being a narrow to a wide ISA or infrasternal angle due to training, or is it purely genetic? So great question. I used to think you could change the infrasternal angle. So by the way, lots of great podcasts on this series. So Bill Hartman, Alex Effer, you have Andrew Paul. I don't know if he went into the ISA too much, and many other individuals talking about infrasternal angle on this show. And so can you go from being a narrow? So a narrow, by the way, is if you, under your sternum, the angle your rib cage makes, if it is less or sharper than 90 degrees and it biases towards more of an exhalation, and that often goes with being a more elastic, bouncy type athlete. You tend to be a leaner skeletal frame in general, like an ectomorph, but not necessarily every narrow is an ectomorph, but that is the generality of more of a narrow type. And then the wide infrasternal angle type, you have a wider angle, wider than 90 degrees under the sternum, and that fits with more of the, you could say, the bigger, bulkier, sturdier, more muscular-driven type athletes tend to trend in that direction. Also realize that it is a spectrum. Something Bill Hartman says is he draws the polarization of, okay, you have the widest of wides and the narrowest of narrows to draw that, just to give a good example, but realize people are going to fall along a spectrum of these things. That being said, can you go from being a narrow to a wide? Well, the infrasternal angle itself will not shape change the way the rest of the body does. The rest of the body will compensate more, so you can't just turn into a narrow who does like a lot of lifting, for example, does a ton of strength training, is not going to become a wide infrasternal angle type, because even within a wide ISA, I wish I had an image, at least for those of you listening audio only, even visual. I could like try to make a pelvis with my hands, and maybe an image, flashing an image of the screen on the screen would be great. I know in looking at Bill Hartman's work, he has the two different types of pelvis shapes, but even it's not just the infrasternal angle. Even the pelvis is shaped differently, and obviously you're not going to take your pelvic bones and just make them a different shape. So these core shapes of the body are your core shapes. It is your core type. So what does happen, though, to a narrow ISA who has a lot of stress and pressure applied to the system, and this is where it can get confusing. I've been confused a lot of times in learning and educating about this model, or being educated in this model. It's one where I've had to be a beginner over and over and over again. But what can happen is a narrow infrasternal angle can end up looking or presenting like a wide in terms of that angle under their rib cage if they don't have a dynamic infrasternal angle, meaning they're so compressed and stuck through a lot of heavy lifting or just stressful compressions or poor breathing patterns that they don't get a good full exhalation, because it's in that exhalation that infrasternal angle will close down towards a more narrow presentation. And I have a good example or story that goes with this, because I think stories really, really help. They're really helpful for me, because sometimes with the terminology, I get lost very easily. I did not do very well in things like calculus or pre-calculus. I should say I'm giving myself too much credit. Even pre-calculus, after the second line or equation went up in high school, I started thinking about track and field or basketball or something else. And so I do really well when I have stories that go with these things. And so I had an athlete, this was at Cal, it was a breaststroker who was, I believe he was a public school, high school 100-meter breaststroke record holder. Really strong guy, and 6'5", really great jumper, could dunk and jump real well, fast, explosive, powerful, but also insanely compressed. And if you would have put your thumbs on his sternum, on his ribs below his sternum, you would have said, oh, this guy's a wide infrasternal angle. That angle is greater than 90 degrees. But the truth is, he just couldn't close that infrasternal angle down. His ribs did not move much at all when he would breathe in and out. And even though I didn't know that much about the narrow and wide infrasternal angles back then, I had taken some postural restoration courses. I was in that world. And so I did know enough to say, hey, when you breathe out, your infrasternal angle doesn't change. Your ribs don't go down. You can't get a great exhale. And this athlete also, his coaches would try to get him to do things in his breaststroke swim, and he just couldn't do it. And it also explains the importance of, look, if you're going to be asked to do something technically in your sport, you need to have the options, the movement options and abilities from an underlying skeletal structural point of view. And so anyways, long story short is we got him to be able to get that rib cage to close, that angle to close, and just got him to do more of a full exhale. And his swimming got better. He felt it. He talked to me later and thanked me for it, for being able to get that breathing ability. And it's not complicated, just to be able to get the ribs down and breathing to get that rib cage to close. A lot of athletes just simply aren't aware of these things. And if they're used to a particular way of walking around and breathing for a long period of time, they can get stuck a little bit. But this athlete also, he had a big bench press. He was extremely strong. I think he had done a lot of pressing in high school and things like that. And of course we lifted. I was a strength coach in college, so of course we lifted then. But it's sometimes that, long story short, is sometimes that narrow who's very compressed from front to back can appear as a wide infrasternal angle, but then you want to work their breathing and work their ability to exhale, get those ribs to move, and you can get them back to that more narrow presentation. But of course, the rest of their body isn't going to change. The pelvis isn't going to change, and all the other things that go into how those archetypes perform is not going to change. And I also say this too, I'm still learning, as I mentioned, having to be a beginner. I know in learning from Adarian Barr, looking at learning from him and being like, man, I know what this guy is saying, and I see the brilliance in it, but I'm going to have to spend a lot of time in this and go through failing and going through this myself and learning. And that's also something I've been going through in learning through Bill Hartman's model. So I'm happy to have learned what I have, but I'm also still on that journey, and it's something that's been really rewarding along the way. Next one is from David, David D. Esquivius. I know your last name, David. I just see the ESQ. So thanks for the question. And so David asks, good idea to rotate sprint, jump, plyo variations bi-weekly or keep for the entire block? So this is an awesome question. And programming is my first love in so many ways. And it still is. I love the creative pursuit of writing training programs. And so I'll just break this question down quickly with just because the lingo. But essentially, let's say I have 2 days a week where I'm sprinting and jumping, 2 sprint and jump days a week, 2 lifting days a week. On those sprint and jump days, do I, for a 4-week training block, do the same thing? Every Monday, it's going to be the same thing. Just let's go. I'm going to do 30-meter sprints and hurdle hops. And I do that every day 1. And then day 2, I do flying 10s and depth jumps. And I do that every day 2. And I do so. But the question is instead of doing that every week of the 4-week block, maybe week 2, instead of doing the 30 meters and hurdle hops, I will instead do a 20-meter sled on shorter rest, more density. And then instead of the hurdle hops, maybe I'll do single leg line hops or something, or single leg hopping over low hurdles. Just a basic small variation. And the same thing or the same idea on the day 2. And so for me, for more beginning athletes who have a lower training age earlier in the program, I will tend to do the same thing for the entire block. For athletes who have a more advanced training age, I will almost always work on a 14-day cycle, or where they're doing workout A is that day 1 workout A, then it's week 2, day 1 is workout B, and rotating that. And the reason why this works with beginner up to advanced or a higher training age is I remember back in the day, Kelly Baggett, for those of you who remember Kelly Baggett and his work, and I remember the Vertical Jump Bible, he wrote that, and I remember him talking about this idea, is that so often a basic strength program for individuals is 3 days a week. Maybe you're squatting 3 days a week. In some situations, maybe it's the exact same workout 3 days a week, which you can do with the beginner. You could even do with an intermediate as long as you're not overloading them. But at some point, as that athlete gets stronger through the 3 days a week of squatting or deadlifting or whatever, they are going to get stronger and their output will get higher. As their output gets higher, they do more, I don't like the word damage because I don't think that sends a good message, but the stress response is greater. It just takes longer to recover from fully, not just on the physical level, the muscle and the physiological, but there's also a mental piece with how high did I, or how much weight did I lift, we could say for the squatting example. But at some point, you have to start going, or at least look at going to, okay, if I'm going to be lifting this hard on each day, I need to have more rest. So now I might go to 2 days a week of squatting so I can still have good intensity, push intensity up. The recovery is also going to get pushed because I'm doing more, I'm just have more output. And that's just one way you could do it. You also can do a high frequency mode in lifting, not to hijack this, but if you do less volume, like a 2 sets of 5, you could also do that where you're not doing so much output so that you can go higher frequency. But a basic move, the basic move is going from 3 days a week down to 2 because your output is higher and you need more rest. Well, we can also extrapolate that out to, okay, we've used up basically even in doing the same workout every day in a cycle. Okay, well now you're putting out enough output so that you did the 30-meter sprints on day 1 in week 1, and now we come back to that same thing in week 2, you may have recovered physically, is what I find. Maybe physically for the most part you're recovered, but are you recovered mentally to go at those 30s at the same intensity? You're hoping to PR again, or you're hoping to be better than last week. And the totality of it sits that, well, if I delayed that workout to week 3 and I just put an alternative in week 2, by the time I get to week 3, I'm excited to do that same workout again. So mentally even, you're allowing for more recovery, and you're also putting in a little bit more variety by having just an alternative week 2. So long story short, I hope I explained that well, but ultimately early on, doing the same thing, totally fine. And that's why I will say too, for strength, I tend to keep strength more the same thing, just because that's in a lot of my programs, not all, but in a lot of my programs, it's really the sprint and jump days that are the highest loading, and the strength supports the sprint jump. You could also put throw in there days. And because my sprint, jump, throw, my plyometric days are the most intensive, I want to give those the most rest. So I will tend to rotate those more on a 14-day cycle. The strength days are generally not going to be my most intensive days, and therefore I tend to stick the same, I'll tend to stick more of the similar week-to-week type progressions for those. Sometimes I will have different things in the warm-up for novelty's sake, but by and large, that tends to be for more advanced, even intermediate athletes in many cases. I will make those rotations. So thank you for that question. We are running down a little bit on time, and I'm not getting through these as well as I wanted to. I did want to take a break and mention that today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym management software. It will effortlessly manage your memberships, class schedules, and billing. To learn more, head to gymstudio.com. There you can set up a free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. All right, let's get to a few other questions in closing this episode down. So Joe Ferrigno asks, do you have any experience using Exergeny? So simple question. I do. I have an Exergeny. I've used it myself and with athletes. I do like it, but I'll fit with just what Chris Korfis has said about that. And I think Chris has had a bunch of them, but it's not as precise of a resistance as having a sled. You have the weight on the sled. It is kind of variable. There is different settings to the Exergeny, but they're kind of, the numbers I feel like aren't so meaningful to people or athletes or coaches as, okay, this was the weight on the sled, this was the surface, or of course, if you have an automated or motorized resistance, you are very precise. That being said, I do like it. I just feel like if you don't have a number tag to it, its best use is if you can anchor it to something, meaning you do a set of Exergeny sprints, okay, now do a set of regular sprints. So that way you're using it more as a sensory tool. You're using it as something to enhance something that is or may have that free sprint you could do is more timed. It has a numerical value, and now it loops into something that's more of a solid anchor. Next question is, by Joe, so thanks again. Would a flag football game replace a speed day? And so there's some context here. So for a track athlete, so I'll just speak on this with track first, because when I was coaching at Wilmington College, so even in my early, I wonder, sometimes this question actually made me think, why and how did I start to put games in the course of my track and field training, even in my early 20s? Because of course I would still do this now. And as I've learned more and more, I'm like, yeah, games are amazing in context, but having games where you can is a really good stimulus. And we would play, this was back at Wilmington, we would play a game every Wednesday in the fall, in the off season. And the game I liked the most for the track team was Ultimate Frisbee. Now, part of this was my own selfish, hey, I love Frisbee. I want to play Frisbee. I want people to play Frisbee with, so let's play. But what it turned into and what I quickly realized was the type of speed that you experience playing a game is a little bit different than, okay, hey, we're going to go to the track, or we're going to do fly 10s, or we're going to do 120s or 150s or whatever. And it's timed, because in a game, and then maybe this goes back to the pressure on some level and the way things run mentally, and exaggerate the error, is when you run in a game, the only pressure is just, did you make the play or didn't you? And even if you didn't, honestly, if it's not your sport and in front of a huge crowd, it's just fun. You had fun. And as I find, running in a game tends to have a timing of the running that's also based on the external stimuli very strongly. It's multi-directional. There's a lot of curvilinear. It's very variable. And so people recovered from that really well. We use it kind of as a recovery day, but people never went into the next day of training or couple days ever being down. They always came in and finished the week really well coming off that Wednesday. And part of it was controlled also. I mean, I was in charge of how long we played. So if I saw people were getting tired at all, we'd stop. We just basically use it long enough to get activated, have fun. And what I tended to do, it's kind of fun because I also could control things a little bit, in that a lot of times I would just take the Frisbee from, our 5-yard line and just launch it and have the sprinters try to chase it down and just have them go all out, because that is a stimulus that it's unique. It's different mentally than just running for time. So in a sense, it was a really nice variable way of looking at it. And it also makes you rethink capacity, because so often it's like, okay, well, we're going to sprint high-low, and you can only sprint fast on these 3 days, and you can't sprint fast on the other days, or whatever your schedule is. But I do find that, and again, there's a certain workload you cannot exceed, you should not exceed. You can overtrain team sport athletes for sure, but just doing it just showed me that you can do some speed, some game play type speed on another day, a recovery day, and athletes would be fine just because it's just different. Mentally, it's different. It's not too much. It was fun. And it's also really mixed in with shuffles and changes of direction and back pedals and all these things that and an aerobic overlay as well. And that aerobic overlay of a continuous motion game also helps it to not hit so hard in the same way the next day versus, hey, we're going to hit complete rest between these reps and then you're going fast and we're timing it. It's just different. And it's on grass too. I should say that. It's on grass too. Now, if it's for a team sport, I think this is where constraint manipulations, changing the space. So if you want to work more top end speed, I just love these ideas. And this is not something I've done directly where I'm coaching. I mean, the only soccer team I've coached is 6-year-old soccer. So it's not like we're going to get into this at all, but like changing the space of the field. So we're going to make it long and rectangular to really encourage top end speed work, or making it short and square. And we're making it more of change of direction and agility oriented. But I really believe in changing the constraints of the game itself when it comes to the team sport and the games. And Kevin Mulcahy's been a podcast guest, and I want to have him on again talking about how we change constraints for team sport, for the game itself to get speed in context of the game. So going back to your question, in context of, let's just say track and field, would it replace a speed day? No, I tried to just set it up so it complemented the speed days. If I wanted to make it a speed day, I think what I would have done was like what Jeremiah Flood had done. Jake Tura talked about this, where they played and then ran actual like fly 10s in between segments of playing. So maybe if we really wanted to make it a speed day, like in the off season, we'd go play in the infield and then go out to the track and run a fly 10 and then come back and do that kind of thing. And then it really would be something where I don't think we could come back the same day in quite that prime state as I described before. All right, next question is, would playing pickup basketball replace a need for hops and bounds? These are great questions, Joe. So thank you for this. So I wouldn't say necessarily replace, but maybe let's start by polarizing this. If I could pick one or the other for most athletes, and let's just say it's not track athletes, and honestly, even for track athletes, I love pickup basketball and jumping-based games. But for non-track athletes, for those of you who have seen Travis Hunter playing basketball, I mean, doing I think between the legs or windmill dunks, I mean, he's insanely athletic. And I don't think I don't know if he did track, or I don't think he has to my knowledge, a strong plyometric background, but you just see how much bounce, how much explosiveness, plyometric effect he's getting just playing basketball and doing dunks. And so I will say, within that caveat of your question, I would say if I could rephrase it to playing basketball and doing dunks in between games or at the end and maybe on a lower hoop, and I could choose that for, let's just say, so the soccer team, the volleyball team, the football team, I would choose that over hops and bounds. Because it's a game, it's athletic, it's multi-directional. And the nature of a running jump as well, it's kind of like a long to high. That's also a little bit easier on the tendons and the connective tissues than, let's just say, like intensive single leg hopping, where you're really driving that single leg bounding hop. Now, if I'm just talking about maxing out someone's ability, then I do want to look at, and just for general plyometric ability. So I will say, qualitative perspective, just being able to do a low intensity single leg hopping buildup where it starts small, there's some level of rhythm. I think that's great. Like the way that John Garish does his skip and hop progression is awesome for all athletes. Just being able to skip for distance, build up, skip for distance, skip for height, all those kind of things, do it smoothly and effectively, I think is great for all athletes. But if we look at, okay, how stimulating is this? What's really bringing it out of an athlete? And where are athletes like mirroring each other, challenging each other, having fun? Mirroring and challenging is so huge. And playing basketball and people trying to outdo each other on dunks after is one of the absolute best things you can do for that. I think if it's done with an overlay of, okay, we have basic plyometric ability, and this talking for team sport athletes, that's awesome. Now for track, if I had to pick one or the other, I definitely would pick plyometrics. Just long term, but of course I love throwing games in there, and games can be transformative for track jumpers. But if it's track and field, I do think those hops and bounds and all things related are a staple of their movement ability in so many ways. So kind of a tough question there, but a great one. And thank you, Joe, for that. Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. So let's go with the Forge Richmond. And this question is, have you used band resistance in training yourself or your athletes? Why or why not? And so for this, I'll say band resistance, there's a few ways to do it. So you have like Michael Yessis, Dr. Yessis, the late Dr. Yessis. He had active cords. If you watch his training from like the 90s, maybe the 80s, like these bands that you would put around they strapped and connected to your ankles, and you could do all sorts of sprint type marches or drills using those active cords as resistance. On the other pole, you have things like looking at powerlifting and wrapping a band around bars for squats and things like that. So that would be the other end of it. I tend to err towards, I rarely at all use any sort of band resistance in squatting and things like that. And the big reason why I mentioned it before is my main stimulus is the dynamic. It's the sprints, the jumps, the throws. And I want to max that out. And if I'm doing a lot of banded work in the weight room, you could just call it over-intensifying the weight room. Now, if you're a power lifter, great, do it. But if you put bands on a squat, you have to think, okay, what is this going to give me that I can hopefully directly apply to my dynamic activities? And also, what might this cost me from a recovery perspective? If banding your squat makes you stronger, but it takes it a little bit out of your recovery and it may impact your dynamic day, that's possibly something you want to look at. I don't think there's anything wrong with using light bands, like just kind of erring on the lighter side of bands. You could still be powerful, but it creates a little bit more sense of urgency. I think that's totally fine and really good. I think once you get to the heavier bands, I think that can be problematic. I will say, so let's talk about dynamic though, because I think that's where sometimes you see these like crazy devices. You can see all sorts of crazy banded devices, but you also have more normal ones like little bands like between the knees and stuff to resist the knee separation and sprinting and marching and that kind of thing. It is interesting. I know Adarian Barr had mentioned that he had used like banded resistance, and something about the vibration of it he didn't quite like. It didn't really fit with how he felt in the movement. And I've never met an individual who feels movement to such a fine point that Adarian does. And so when he says something like that, I definitely trust him. So I do think there's something that is definitely true with that. But at the same time, I feel like just if you're talking just general mechanical tension, like you use bands and you really are fatiguing or finishing the hip flexors, I don't see anything bad with that at all. I will say, I personally would hesitate using a lot of banded based work to improve technical elements of sprinting. Not that I think you couldn't, but I just think that you may want to be a little careful with it. Where I do like the bands, though, I do like the active cord ideas, just in the sense of, like I mentioned, general hip flexor training. Bands really help train the hip flexors well, just from a general perspective, not specific to the timing of sprinting or the total feeling of it, but just using a basic band. I've had Instagram videos of this to help drive the knee forward, to help feel the hard isometric at the end, feel that hip flexor going. I've actually found using banded hip flexor work that really forces that hip flexor to work both statically and dynamically actually really helps in single leg jump, just that quick, powerful pop of the hip flexor coming forward. So I think generally bands can be great. I have a little hesitation trying to get real specific with it, but just like the Exergeny, you could do some reps with it on, some reps with it off, and use it as just an alternative overload, because all things that are not the actual skill are always going to have something that doesn't fit. That's why they're not the actual skills. So trending more into that, I would just use it as a differentiation tool. But long story short, I don't like heavy bands for lifting patterns, maybe light bands. I do like them, bands for training hip flexors generally. I do think they have a lot to offer there. Other than that, using it in contrast would probably be a good idea, just to make sure the way the resistance is hitting you is being used properly and well when it comes to your dynamic movement. So that finishes this, I should say weeks. It's been a while since I did this, but that finishes this Q&A. Thank you so much for all of you who asked questions. Those of you whose questions I did not get to, I will save in an alternative file. And next time I do this, I will look to get to those. So thanks again and have a great week.